No, no, I mean, brilliant. I don't know if the audience is feeling it the way I am, because I think these are incredible responses. So I want to stay with it a little more because I'm really learning. Uh, you know, let's go from mobilization and resistance. Let's look back a little bit. Let's look at cultural revolution. You look at, let's say, cultural revolution with somebody like Lenin, it would be mass literacy uh, policies. In the film, they say two-thirds of the population is illiterate. And then you come to the 50s, 60s with people like Frantz Fanon, who said exactly what Angela said earlier. Your culture is developed through your activities of decolonizing yourself. Your culture is not just lying somewhere and you can just go and pick it up. But as you fight the colonizer, in fact, I was reading Frederick Jameson recently. He said Cuba is an excellent example of that, where people create their culture through resistance and mobilization against something. Now, if you take Africa today, I'll go back to this again. We are seized between two new forms of colonialism, and I don't even know the names. That is, on the one hand, these forces of globalization. Sam Ben Usman used to have a great way. First, they brought us colonialism, and then they brought us independence, and now they bring us democracy, and now they're bringing us terrorism. So we caught there, and then we also have, I mean, serious fundamentalism. There was a point I didn't know what to say when the French went to Mali, to so-called free Mali. I didn't know what to do. Should I. So they put you in that situation. Now, what is a cultural? What would look like? I think you answered it, but I want to push you more. What would cultural revolution look like in these African countries caught between two forms of colonialism? Qataris and Arabians on the one hand, and America, Barack Obama, and Orlando on the other hand. So, we're in the middle and we're reacting. I just thought I asked that because I have two brilliant people here. If they don't give me something, I'll be left by myself. So,
I just, this is why you have your inner thoughts. You don't want to say, um, um, the great Egyptian um, director, huh? Who passed away. Yusuf Saeed did a movie called Destiny some time ago about intolerance in Spain in the during the 700 years that the Moors occupied Spain, and I I remember in the sense the thinking that certainly one of the discussions has to be around tolerance itself and and the struggle against that for that. I mean, because we see essentially certain polarizations that are happening. Mali, in a sense, have over its nearly 50 years of independence, even though one of the poorest countries in the world, there was some sense that there was some sense of stabilization there. Even though we know that in the north it was always the war and the fight with Tariq, and they were happening there, but it had to have some sort of, you got a sense of that. And basically when you talk about whether it's filmmakers or whether it's artists that came out of there, the voices that came out of Mali at the particular moment, and brilliant voices that had gave some sort of cultural um, leverage, weight to what was happening and the possibilities there. Um, and so I think certainly the questions that we have to ask ourselves around what is happening in Africa have to be centered around understanding that this process of recolonization of Africa for its particular resources, and that in some place where the role that the Chinese play, and we have what we termed a new kind of East-West dynamic, a struggle or a friction in terms of that, the role that they play as each of the expansion is the expansion of global capitalism in that sense, whether it's the state capitalism represented by China and the form of state capitalism that we exist in as well. But that's the term to take this and repossess this and to have some sort of control over not only people and what they how they move physically, but also control over what they think and as well. So what are the answers around that? You know, when we're all we're part of all those dynamics from every one of us from independence with Ghana in 1957, watching the vision of that vision to even the movements around the non-aligned movements, the subsequent movements around uh, um, independence around the Portuguese colonies and the expectations of that, and even South Africa, as we talk about South Africa, the expectations of that. And now we find ourselves finding out that there's another place. I think as whatever people may think about Mandela in terms of who he was and what he did, I'm sure that he died not only a broken-hearted man for South Africa, for South Africa, but also a broken-hearted man for the continent itself. You know, so and again, I don't have any crystal ball. I would hope that we would see the kind of evolution of political thought and that Latin America is going through it right now. But even they are dealing with a bunch of internal conflicts where we have juxtaposed to these extraordinary movements, populist movements, which bring the power, these governments that tend to be social democratic or from the left, on the other hand, and at the same time, they still have to deal with the issues of global capital. They have to deal with their national capitalists as well as those national capitalists and the role that they play as global capitalists as well. So, on the one hand, we have to deal with what are the answers in terms of that. You know, certainly we can make an argument that in Africa, in some parts of Africa, you may have the very strict conflict between Islam and Christianity, and a radical or a very narrow Islam as opposed to a one that expresses a certain level of tolerance. All those particular things. But I think I think the key is still the key and has always been the key is how do we develop movements, how do movements evolve within civil society, how do movements evolve around women's defending the land and defending the family, how do movements evolve around and in such a way that's separate from the other kind of movements that tend to draw us apart. You know, those movements and certainly led by women tend to bring people together and tend to kind of find some new language in which to deal with the particular issues and particularly crisis that's happening between women and children and food security, families, and slash communities. Those are the movements that we have to find and support. I think at this particular moment, you know, and art plays what role art plays in that is certainly going to be fundamental in terms of how those movements come. But I think the movements certainly are going to have to be centered around women.
Well, yeah, let me say absolutely, absolutely. Um, and I also think we should back up a little bit. And in this country, we have the tendency to forget about history, you know, to leave it behind. And I think it is so important to remember moments of promise. In the US, the period after slavery, the period of radical Reconstruction, was the most radical era in the history of this country. And we cannot forget that. And when we look at the liberation movements on the continent of Africa that inspired all of us who are of the age to have been politicized during that era, there would have been no Black liberation movement as we know it in the US without the liberation movements in Africa, in Angola, and Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique, uh, and I think it's really important to create a memory, a historical memory of that era where we could really talk about internationalism and international solidarity. And it was something real, it was something palpable. We felt connections with people who were struggling, not only in Africa, but in Latin America and in Asia. And so a part of building that culture, of forging that culture, is reminding ourselves that we do have these historical moments that can remain alive in our hearts and in the way that we organize. I think the kind of culture we need in the 21st century is going to have to be an internationalist culture. And I specifically use the term internationalist as opposed to global or some of the other, because internationalists in my, I think captures that sense of activist unity. Why have we completely forgotten about Afro-Asian movements? And so that can't provide all of the culture, but it can be a kind of foundation for a new internationalist culture that we definitely need if we're going to be able to stand up to the horrendous effects of capitalism. And the last time I was at NYU was during Occupy, right? As a matter of fact, I was invited to speak at NYU and then went over to Wall Street, but also there was an assembly that happened at in Washington Square Park. So I participated, and I think we have to remember Occupy. Just as we've forgotten the radical Reconstruction, we've forgotten something that happened 2.5 years ago, because that gave us the opportunity to speak publicly, critically about capitalism in a way that has not happened in this country since the 1930s. And we have to hold on to that and build on it and create our 21st century internationalism.
No, meanwhile, yes. I'm gonna pass the mic to you soon. So people who want to ask questions, we have two stands, one there and one on the other side. So if you can stand in line, we'll be very happy. And we may be getting some questions also from up there, written questions, if possible. The two things that I remember, I remember Angela telling me a story one time. I think you were in Guinea-Conakry with Sekou Touré, where, you're talking about Black internationalism, working, partying, and until 4 o'clock in the morning, and Sekou Touré giving you cola nuts to keep you up. So, and of course, Danny and I have traveled a lot in Africa and in Guinea-Conakry, and we were there. Your name kept coming, you and Fanny Luhammer, when you were in Conakry. Angela's image for us in Africa is not just image. We're talking about crisis of representation, but it's also basically seeing you struggle in the United States, inspiring us that we too could struggle in Africa. This was very important to us. So tell us a little bit about Africa while your travels, because you talk about internationalism. You know, when we were in Algeria together, Danny, they also told us that, in Algeria in those days, you did not only have the Black Panthers, but you also had SWAPO, you had ANC, you had Vietnamese, you had all these organizations, and you had music from free jazz. And in many ways, what was happening in Algeria was informing the struggle in the United States here, and vice versa. So tell us, both of you are great travelers in Africa. Tell us, and then we go to the questions.
Well, yeah. Well, I remember meeting Agostino Neto at an MPLA camp in Tanzania. This was before the victory, of course. And what so impressed me about him was he was this remarkable poet, this artist who was also the leader of a military organization that was going to overturn the rule of the Portuguese in Angola, and they did. Yeah, there was a symbiotic relationship, I think, between what was going on the continent and what was happening in the U.S. As I said before, I don't think that our movements would have been possible without the inspiration and the demonstrations that came to us from Africa. So let's see. I've visited. I can tell you a story about the 10th anniversary of the revolution in Congo Brazzaville, where all of the heads of state, yes, all of the heads of state from throughout the continent of Africa were there, and that was a moment. That was, I think, in 1973, where there was hope. There was hope. There was hope based on the non-aligned movement, which was to be, maybe if not explicitly communist, some kind of a socialist path, at least non-capitalist path. And that was a moment when we really believed that revolution was possible in the world. And I can say that those of us who considered ourselves revolutionaries in this country, we could imagine ourselves winning a revolution here only because of what was happening on the continent of Africa. And then the last time was, and I saw you in Accra, which was in Ghana, which was it's the Yadi Yadi conference a little less than a year ago, I think.
And it's amazing when Angela travels to Africa, how even young kids, basically, they follow her. They all seem to have known her forever. It looked like they were there in the 60s. So it was really beautiful.
Well, I have to say that that's only because of the amazing organizing work that was done and the memories that get passed from generation to generation. I can't, I'm not responsible for that at all. And I can't take credit for any of the notoriety that I have achieved. It's because people were involved in, organizing this campaign. Then that movement moved from continent to continent, from community to community, from country to country, from continent to continent. And I was just the very fortunate beneficiary of that work. And so when I see that people recognize me today, whether it's here or whether it's in Africa or Cuba, I have to very humbly say that this is because of the work that so many people did, whose names will never be known to us. And speaking about building a culture of resistance, I always like to emphasize that that has to involve recognizing the power of ordinary people. We tend to focus on the names and the leaders, but we forget that it's people who organize and people whose names are not written down in the historical records who are really responsible for this work. And that was one of the reasons one of the many reasons I revere Nelson Mandela, because he always pointed out that he was one of many men and women who were involved, who dedicated their lives to that struggle.